Welcome to our channel, and thank you for joining us today for this deep exploration into one of the most fascinating theological debates in religious history. If you find this content valuable, please like this video and subscribe for more thought-provoking discussions on philosophy, religion, and spirituality. Today we are diving into the complex relationship between Gnosticism and Christianity, two religious movements that emerged from similar historical contexts, yet developed radically different understandings of God, humanity, and salvation. To understand the tension between Gnosticism and Christianity, we must first examine their historical origins and development. Christianity, as we know it today, began in the 1st century CE with the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth and his apostles. The early Christian movement was diverse, with various communities interpreting Jesus' teachings in different ways. Some focused on his ethical teachings, others on his role as Messiah, and still others on his divine nature. During this same period, Gnostic movements were also emerging, drawing from various sources including Jewish mysticism, Greek philosophy, Persian dualism, and early Christian ideas. The term Gnosticism comes from the Greek word gnosis, meaning knowledge, but not just any knowledge. Rather, a special spiritual knowledge or insight that leads to salvation. Gnostic movements were incredibly diverse, spanning centuries and cultures, but they shared certain core beliefs that set them apart from Orthodox Christianity. These movements flourished particularly in the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, often existing alongside and sometimes within Christian communities. The fundamental difference between Gnosticism and Christianity lies in their understanding of the nature of reality and the path to salvation. Christianity, particularly as it developed into orthodoxy, teaches that the material world was created by God and declared good. The book of Genesis states that God looked upon his creation and saw that it was good. This affirms the inherent value and sanctity of the physical world, including human bodies and earthly existence. For Christians, salvation comes through faith in Jesus Christ, who is both fully human and fully divine, and who died and rose again to redeem humanity from sin. Gnosticism, by contrast, presents a radically different cosmology. Most Gnostic systems teach that the material world is not the creation of the true supreme God, but rather the flawed or even malevolent creation of a lesser divine being, often called the demiurge. This world is seen as a prison or trap for divine sparks of light that have become trapped in matter. The goal of Gnostic spirituality is to awaken to this truth through gnosis, and to escape the material realm to return to the spiritual realm of the true God. Let us examine the Gnostic creation myth in more detail, as it illustrates this fundamental difference. In many Gnostic texts, the story begins with the supreme unknowable God who exists in perfect unity and silence. From this God emanate various divine beings called eons, who exist in the spiritual realm called the pleroma, or fullness. The crisis begins when one of these eons, typically Sophia, meaning wisdom, acts without the consent of her divine partner and creates a flawed being. This being, the demiurge, believes himself to be the supreme God and proceeds to create the material world and human beings, trapping divine sparks within physical bodies. This cosmology has profound implications for how Gnostics understand human nature and destiny. Unlike Christianity, which teaches that humans are created in the image of God and are inherently valuable, Gnosticism typically divides humanity into three categories. The pneumatic, or spiritual people, possess the divine spark and can achieve gnosis and salvation. The psychic, or soul people, can potentially be saved through faith and good works, but are not guaranteed salvation. The hylic, or material people, are bound to the material world and cannot achieve true spiritual liberation. The path to salvation in Gnosticism is therefore fundamentally different from Christianity. While Christianity emphasizes faith in Jesus Christ, grace from God, and often sacramental practices, Gnosticism focuses on acquiring secret knowledge or gnosis. This knowledge is not intellectual understanding, but rather a direct spiritual experience or revelation that awakens the individual to their true divine nature and the illusory nature of the material world. This gnosis often comes through special teachings, secret texts, or mystical experiences that reveal the true nature of reality. The role of Jesus Christ presents another significant point of divergence between these two traditions. Orthodox Christianity teaches that Jesus is the incarnate Son of God who took on human flesh, died on the cross for the sins of humanity, and rose from the dead. The Incarnation, the idea that God became human, is central to Christian theology and affirms the value of both divine and human nature. Many Gnostic groups had very different understandings of Jesus. Some taught that Jesus was a divine being who only appeared to have human form, a doctrine known as Gnosticism. Others believed that the divine Christ Spirit descended upon the human Jesus at his baptism and departed before his crucifixion. Still others saw Jesus primarily as a teacher who came to reveal secret knowledge, rather than as a savior who died for sins. These different Christologies reflect the Gnostic discomfort with the idea that the divine would truly unite with corrupt matter. The question of scripture and authority also reveals important differences between Gnosticism and Christianity. Early Christianity gradually developed a canon of scriptures that became the New Testament, including the four Gospels, Acts of the Apostles, the letters of Paul and other apostolic writings, and the Book of Revelation. These texts were accepted by the broader Christian community as authoritative and inspired by God. Gnostic communities, however, produced their own extensive literature, including Gospels, Acts, Apocalypses, and treatises that claimed to preserve secret teachings of Jesus or other divine revelations. Texts like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Mary, and many others offered alternative accounts of Jesus' teachings and alternative paths to spiritual enlightenment. These texts were often attributed to apostles or other early Christian figures, but were generally written later than the canonical New Testament books. The discovery of the Nag Hammadi Library in Egypt in 1945 revolutionized our understanding of ancient Gnosticism by providing scholars with a wealth of original Gnostic texts, rather than just the descriptions provided by their Christian opponents. These texts revealed the diversity and sophistication of Gnostic thought and showed that the relationship between Gnosticism and Christianity was more complex than previously understood. The social and cultural contexts in which Gnosticism and Christianity developed also shaped their different emphases. Christianity emerged from Judaism and retained many Jewish concepts, including monotheism, the importance of history and community, and the goodness of creation. Early Christians also lived in expectation of the imminent return of Christ and the establishment of God's kingdom on earth, which gave them a positive orientation toward history and the future. Gnosticism, by contrast, developed in a more cosmopolitan environment influenced by Greek philosophy, Persian dualism, and various mystery religions. The Gnostic emphasis on escape from the material world and return to a spiritual realm reflects the influence of Platonic philosophy, which taught that the material world was a mere shadow of eternal spiritual realities. The dualistic elements in Gnosticism may have been influenced by Persian Zoroastrianism, which taught about the cosmic struggle between good and evil, light and darkness. The attitude toward the body and sexuality represents another area where Gnosticism and Christianity often differed significantly. While Christianity developed various attitudes toward sexuality and the body, ranging from the celebration of marriage to the embrace of celibacy, it generally maintained that the body was created by God and would be resurrected in the Eschaton. Some Christian traditions emphasize the goodness of creation, including human sexuality within marriage, while others promoted celibacy as a higher spiritual calling, but both perspectives affirmed that the body had value and purpose. Many Gnostic groups, by contrast, viewed the body as a prison for the divine spirit and sexuality as a trap that further entangles the soul in matter. Some Gnostic communities practice strict asceticism, avoiding marriage, sexuality, and even certain foods in an attempt to minimize their engagement with the material world. Paradoxically, other Gnostic groups embraced libertinism, arguing that since the material world was illusory, moral restrictions did not apply to the spiritually enlightened. Both approaches reflect the fundamental Gnostic devaluation of the material realm. The question of salvation and its availability to all people presents another crucial difference between these traditions. Christianity, particularly as articulated by Paul, teaches that salvation is available to all people regardless of their social status, ethnicity, or gender. The Christian message proclaimed that in Christ there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, but all are one. While Christian communities sometimes struggle to live up to this ideal, the theological principle of universal accessibility to salvation remains central to Christian teaching. Gnosticism, with its division of humanity into spiritual, psychic, and material categories, was inherently more elitist. Only those with the divine spark could achieve true gnosis and salvation, while others were either limited to a lesser form of salvation or doomed to remain trapped in matter. This created a two-tiered system where the Gnostic elite possessed special knowledge and spiritual status that was not available to ordinary believers. The relationship between faith and knowledge represents another fundamental point of difference. Christianity, while valuing knowledge and understanding, has traditionally emphasized faith as the primary means of relating to God. Faith is understood not merely as intellectual assent, but as trust, commitment, and relationship with God through Christ. Christian theology has generally maintained that God remains ultimately mysterious and that human reason has limits that require the supplement of faith and revelation. Gnosticism, while not rejecting faith entirely, placed primary emphasis on gnosis or direct spiritual knowledge. This knowledge was understood to provide certain and immediate access to spiritual truth that transcended the need for faith or external authority. The Gnostic adept claimed to know, rather than merely believe, the ultimate nature of reality and their own divine identity. The political and social implications of these different emphases are significant. Christianity, with its emphasis on faith, community, and the goodness of creation, has generally been more oriented toward engagement with the world, including efforts to transform society according to Christian values. While Christians have sometimes withdrawn from worldly engagement, the mainstream tradition has emphasized responsibility for others, care for the poor, and the transformation of unjust social structures. Gnosticism, with its emphasis on escape from the world and its elitist understanding of salvation, has tended toward withdrawal from social and political engagement. If the material world is fundamentally flawed and only a spiritual elite can achieve true salvation, then there is little motivation to work for social justice or the common good. This world is to be escaped rather than transformed. The early Christian church fathers were deeply concerned about the influence of Gnostic ideas on Christian communities and wrote extensively against what they saw as dangerous heresies. Figures like Irenaeus, Tertullian, Hippolytus, and Epiphanius devoted considerable effort to refuting Gnostic teachings and establishing orthodox Christian doctrine. Their writings provide us with much of our historical knowledge about early Gnostic movements, though scholars recognize that these sources may be biased and may not always accurately represent Gnostic beliefs. The conflict between Gnosticism and Orthodox Christianity was not merely theological, but also practical and pastoral. Church leaders were concerned that Gnostic teachings would undermine Christian community life, lead believers away from the hope of bodily resurrection, and create divisions between spiritual elites and ordinary believers. They argued that Gnostic claims to possess secret knowledge contradicted the public nature of the Christian gospel and the accessibility of salvation to all who believe. Despite the opposition of Orthodox Christian leaders, Gnostic ideas continued to influence Christian thought throughout history. Medieval movements like the Cathars and Bogomils showed clear Gnostic influences, with their dualistic cosmologies and rejection of the material world. During the Renaissance, interest in Hermetic and mystical traditions brought renewed attention to Gnostic themes. In the modern period, scholars and spiritual seekers have rediscovered Gnostic texts and ideas, leading to both scholarly study in contemporary Gnostic movements. The influence of Gnostic themes can be seen in various aspects of modern culture, including literature, philosophy, and popular spirituality. The emphasis on hidden knowledge, spiritual elites, and the rejection of conventional reality resonates with many contemporary seekers who are disillusioned with traditional religious institutions. However, critics argue that modern Gnosticism often lacks the rigorous philosophical framework of ancient systems and may promote spiritual narcissism and social withdrawal. The relationship between mysticism and Orthodox religion also illuminates the Gnostic-Christian divide. Christianity has always included mystical traditions that emphasize direct experience of God, contemplative practice, and the transcendence of ordinary consciousness. Figures like Pseudo-Dionysius, Meister Eckhart, and John of the Cross developed sophisticated theologies of mystical experience that remained within the bounds of Orthodox Christian teaching. However, Christian mysticism generally maintains the goodness of creation, the importance of community, and the accessibility of salvation to all believers. Christian mystics may seek direct experience of God, but they typically affirm that this experience complements rather than replaces faith, scripture, and church teaching. They also generally maintain that mystical experience should lead to greater love and service rather than withdrawal from the world. Gnostic mysticism, by contrast, tends toward more radical claims about the identity between the self and God, the illusory nature of ordinary reality, and the superiority of direct knowledge over faith and community. While both traditions value spiritual experience, they interpret that experience very differently and draw different conclusions about its implications for life in the world. The question of theodicy, or the problem of evil, also reveals important differences between these traditions. Christianity has struggled throughout its history to reconcile belief in an all-good, all-powerful God with the reality of suffering and evil in the world. Various theological solutions have been proposed, including the free will defense, the soul-making theodicy, and the mysterious nature of divine providence, but the problem remains a challenging one for Christian theology. Gnosticism provides a more radical solution to the problem of evil by denying that the true God is responsible for the creation of the world. If the material world is the creation of an ignorant or malevolent demiurge, then suffering and evil are explained as natural consequences of this flawed creation. The true God remains perfectly good and untainted by worldly evil, but is also more remote from human experience and less involved in history. The eschatological visions of these traditions also differ significantly. Christianity teaches about the resurrection of the dead, the final judgment, and the establishment of God's kingdom either in a renewed earth or in heaven. This vision affirms the ultimate significance of history, the value of bodily existence, and the possibility of cosmic redemption that includes the material world. Gnostic eschatology typically focuses on the individual soul's escape from matter and return to the spiritual realm. While some Gnostic texts speak of cosmic restoration, the emphasis is generally on personal salvation rather than the redemption of history or the material world. The ultimate goal is the dissolution of the cosmos and the return of all divine sparks to their spiritual source. The role of women in early Gnostic and Christian communities presents an interesting area of comparison. Some Gnostic texts, including the Gospel of Mary and the Gospel of Philip, portray women disciples, including Mary Magdalene, as recipients of special revelation and spiritual authority. These texts suggest that some Gnostic communities may have been more egalitarian in their treatment of women than mainstream Christian churches. However, the evidence is complex, and scholars debate whether Gnosticism was consistently more favorable to women than Christianity. Some Gnostic texts contain misogynistic elements, and the emphasis on transcending bodily existence sometimes included negative attitudes toward feminine characteristics associated with matter and sexuality. Christianity, while often restricting women's roles in church leadership, generally affirmed the spiritual equality of men and women and the value of marriage and family life. The liturgical and sacramental practices of Gnostic and Christian communities also reflected their different theological emphases. Christian worship centered on the Eucharist or communion, which celebrated the incarnation, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ and anticipated the messianic banquet in God's kingdom. Baptism initiated believers into the Christian community and symbolized death to sin and resurrection to new life in Christ. Gnostic communities developed their own ritual practices that reflected their understanding of spiritual enlightenment and escape from matter. Some groups practiced elaborate initiation rites that symbolized the soul's journey through various spiritual realms. Others developed alternative interpretations of Christian sacraments, emphasizing their spiritual rather than material significance. The bridal chamber mentioned in some Gnostic texts may have been a ritual that symbolized the reunion of the soul with its divine counterpart. The intellectual and philosophical sophistication of Gnostic systems should not be underestimated. Many Gnostic texts demonstrate careful engagement with contemporary philosophical problems, sophisticated theological reflection, and creative mythological imagination. Thinkers like Valentinus developed complex systems that attempted to reconcile Christian revelation with Greek philosophical insights and to address fundamental questions about the nature of God, the origin of evil, and the destiny of the human soul. However, critics of Gnosticism, both ancient and modern, have argued that its philosophical sophistication sometimes came at the expense of practical wisdom and spiritual health. The emphasis on secret knowledge and spiritual elitism could lead to pride and divisiveness, while the rejection of the material world could result in neglect of moral and social responsibilities. Orthodox Christian thinkers argued that Gnostic systems were ultimately based on human speculation rather than divine revelation and that they led believers away from the simple faith and love that Christ commanded. The modern rediscovery of Gnostic texts has led to significant scholarly reassessment of early Christian history and the development of Christian doctrine. Scholars now recognize that early Christianity was more diverse than previously understood and that the process by which Orthodox doctrine emerged was more complex and contested than earlier accounts suggested. This has led to greater appreciation for the variety of early Christian voices and the contingent nature of doctrinal development. However, this scholarly reassessment has also raised questions about religious authority and the nature of truth. If early Christianity was more diverse and if Gnostic voices were suppressed by political and institutional forces rather than refuted by superior arguments, then what basis exists for preferring orthodox over heterodox interpretations? Some scholars and spiritual seekers have concluded that Gnostic insights deserve equal consideration with Orthodox teachings, while others maintain that the Church Fathers had good reasons for rejecting Gnostic alternatives. The psychological and spiritual appeal of Gnostic themes in contemporary culture reflects broader patterns of religious seeking and spiritual dissatisfaction. The emphasis on hidden knowledge, personal enlightenment, and escape from conventional reality resonates with individuals who feel alienated from traditional religious institutions and skeptical of inherited authorities. The Gnostic promise of direct spiritual experience and elite spiritual status appeals to those who seek spiritual distinction and certainty. However, critics argue that contemporary interest in Gnosticism often reflects spiritual narcissism and cultural privilege rather than genuine spiritual seeking. The emphasis on individual enlightenment and withdrawal from the world can serve as a convenient justification for avoiding the difficult work of social engagement and moral transformation. The appeal to secret knowledge can become a form of spiritual consumerism that seeks exotic teachings and experiences without the commitment and discipline required for authentic spiritual growth. The environmental implications of Gnostic and Christian worldviews have become increasingly relevant in contemporary discussions about ecological crisis and sustainability. Christianity, with its affirmation of the goodness of creation and human responsibility as stewards of the earth, provides theological resources for environmental engagement, even though Christian communities have not always lived up to these implications. Gnosticism, with its fundamental rejection of the material world and emphasis on escape from bodily existence, offers little motivation for environmental concern. If the natural world is a flawed prison created by an ignorant demiurge, then its destruction might even be seen as hastening the liberation of trapped divine sparks. Contemporary environmental theologians have generally looked to Orthodox Christian traditions rather than Gnostic alternatives for resources to address ecological challenges. The gender and sexuality discussions in contemporary religion also intersect with Gnostic and Christian perspectives in complex ways. Some contemporary feminist and LGBTQ religious thinkers have found resources in Gnostic texts that seem to challenge conventional gender roles and celebrate alternative forms of spirituality. The Gospel of Philip, for example, speaks of the union of opposites and the transcendence of gender distinctions in spiritual enlightenment. However, other scholars argue that ancient Gnostic attitudes toward gender and sexuality were often more complex and sometimes more restrictive than contemporary readings suggest. The emphasis on transcending bodily existence could lead to the devaluation of sexual identity and embodied experience, while the dualistic framework could reinforce rather than challenge hierarchical thinking about gender and sexuality. The question of religious pluralism and the relationship between different spiritual traditions also illuminates the differences between Gnostic and Christian approaches. Christianity has developed various approaches to religious diversity, ranging from exclusivism through inclusivism to pluralism, but has generally maintained that Jesus Christ plays a unique and decisive role in human salvation. Gnosticism, with its emphasis on universal spiritual principles and the transcendence of particular historical forms, might seem more naturally suited to pluralistic approaches to religion. The Gnostic understanding of gnosis as a universal spiritual capacity could potentially encompass insights from various religious traditions, while the rejection of material particularity could minimize the importance of specific historical revelations. However, ancient Gnostic communities were often as exclusive and sectarian as their Orthodox Christian counterparts, claiming to possess unique insights and superior spiritual status. Contemporary Gnostic movements sometimes display similar tendencies toward elitism and dismissal of other spiritual paths despite their theoretical openness to universal spiritual principles. The practical implications of these different worldviews for daily life and social engagement represent perhaps the most significant differences between Gnosticism and Christianity. Christianity, with its affirmation of creation, incarnation, and resurrection, provides theological motivation for engagement with the world, including care for the poor, working for justice, and building loving communities. The Christian understanding of salvation as both individual and communal emphasizes the importance of relationships and social responsibility, while the hope for bodily resurrection affirms the ultimate significance of historical existence and material reality. Christian saints and spiritual teachers have generally combined contemplative practice with active service and social engagement. Gnosticism, with its emphasis on escape from the world and individual enlightenment, tends toward withdrawal from social and political engagement. If the material world is fundamentally flawed and only a spiritual elite can achieve salvation, then efforts to transform society or care for others may seem futile or even counterproductive. The goal is personal liberation rather than social transformation. The influence of these ancient debates continues to shape contemporary theological discussions in ways that many people do not fully recognize. Modern Christian denominations still grapple with questions that were first raised in the confrontation with Gnostic thought. The relationship between faith and reason, the role of mystical experience in religious life, the problem of evil and suffering, and the balance between individual spirituality and communal faith all reflect ongoing tensions that were first articulated in the early centuries of Christian history. Contemporary Protestant evangelicalism, for example, often emphasizes personal relationship with Jesus Christ and individual Bible study in ways that echo some Gnostic themes, even while maintaining Orthodox Christian doctrine. The evangelical emphasis on being born again and having a personal encounter with Christ resonates with the Gnostic emphasis on spiritual awakening and transformation, though evangelicals would strongly reject the Gnostic devaluation of the material world and the exclusivity of salvation. Similarly, modern Catholic and Orthodox mystical traditions continue to wrestle with how to affirm the possibility of direct spiritual experience while avoiding the Gnostic pitfalls of elitism and world rejection. The rich mystical traditions of these churches, including contemplative prayer, monastic spirituality, and devotional practices, seek to provide pathways to deeper spiritual experience that remain grounded in orthodox doctrine and communal life. The New Age movement that emerged in the latter half of the 20th century demonstrates clear Gnostic influences in its emphasis on hidden spiritual knowledge, personal transformation, and the discovery of one's divine nature. New Age teachings often present a cosmology remarkably similar to ancient Gnostic systems, with an emphasis on spiritual evolution, the transcendence of material limitations, and the recovery of lost spiritual wisdom. The popularity of channel teachings, past life regression, and alternative spiritual practices reflects the enduring appeal of the Gnostic promise that ordinary reality is not the final truth about existence. However, the New Age appropriation of Gnostic themes often lacks the philosophical rigor and spiritual discipline that characterized ancient Gnostic systems. Where ancient Gnostics developed complex theological systems and often practiced demanding ascetic disciplines, contemporary New Age movements sometimes reduce these insights to simple techniques for personal empowerment and material success. This transformation illustrates how spiritual ideas can be adapted and modified as they move across cultural and historical boundaries. The academic study of religion has also been profoundly influenced by the rediscovery of Gnostic texts and the reassessment of early Christian history. Scholars in the field of religious studies now recognize that the development of religious traditions is far more complex and contested than earlier generations understood. The neat categories of orthodoxy and heresy that dominated earlier scholarship have given way to more nuanced understandings of religious diversity and the political and social factors that influence doctrinal development. This scholarly revolution has implications that extend beyond academic circles. If religious traditions are more diverse and historically contingent than previously understood, then questions arise about religious authority and the basis for doctrinal claims. Some contemporary Christians have embraced this complexity as an opportunity for theological renewal and interfaith dialogue, while others have reacted with concern about the potential relativization of Christian truth claims. The psychological dimensions of the Gnostic Christian debate also deserve careful consideration. The appeal of Gnostic themes often reflects deep human needs for meaning, transcendence, and spiritual significance that may not be adequately addressed by conventional religious institutions. The promise of secret knowledge and elite spiritual status can provide a sense of specialness and purpose that ordinary life seems to lack. However, psychological analysis also reveals potential dangers in Gnostic approaches to spirituality. The emphasis on hidden knowledge can foster intellectual pride and spiritual arrogance, while the division of humanity into spiritual categories can justify indifference toward the suffering of others. The focus on escape from the world can become a form of spiritual bypassing that avoids the difficult work of psychological and social maturation. Christian psychology and spirituality, by contrast, generally emphasizes the importance of integration, humility, and service to others. While Christianity certainly recognizes the reality of spiritual transformation and growth, it typically insists that authentic spirituality must be grounded in love for God and neighbor rather than in claims to special knowledge or spiritual status. The artistic and cultural expressions of these different spiritual orientations also reflect their fundamental theological differences. Christian art throughout history has generally celebrated the Incarnation by depicting the beauty of creation, the humanity of Christ, and the glory of saints and martyrs who lived faithful lives in the world. Gothic cathedrals, Renaissance paintings, and contemporary Christian music often seek to make the sacred present within material reality rather than to escape from it. Gnostic-influenced art and literature, by contrast, often emphasizes themes of alienation, transcendence, and the hiddenness of spiritual truth. From the Romantic poets through modern surrealism to contemporary science fiction, many artistic movements have explored Gnostic themes of imprisonment in an illusory world and the search for hidden spiritual reality. These works often express a profound dissatisfaction with conventional reality and a longing for transformation that transcends ordinary experience. The ethical implications of these different worldviews extend into contemporary debates about social justice, environmental responsibility, and political engagement. Christian social teaching has generally emphasized the responsibility of believers to work for justice, peace, and the common good, based on the understanding that all people are created in the image of God and that the material world has inherent value and dignity. Liberation theology, which emerged in Latin America in the 20th century, represents perhaps the strongest contemporary expression of Christian social engagement, drawing on biblical themes of justice and God's preferential option for the poor. Liberation theologians argue that authentic Christian faith must include commitment to social transformation and that spiritual liberation cannot be separated from political and economic liberation. Gnostic approaches to spirituality, by contrast, have generally been less concerned with social and political transformation. If the material world is fundamentally flawed and if only a spiritual elite can achieve true enlightenment, then efforts to reform social structures may seem pointless or even counterproductive. The goal is individual escape rather than collective transformation. However, some contemporary thinkers have attempted to develop socially engaged forms of Gnosticism that maintain the tradition's emphasis on spiritual awakening while also embracing responsibility for the world. These efforts face the challenge of reconciling the fundamental Gnostic critique of material existence with the practical demands of social and environmental engagement. The question of truth and religious knowledge represents another area where the Gnostic Christian debate continues to be relevant. Christianity has generally maintained that religious truth is accessible through revelation, scripture, tradition, and reason, and that this truth can be communicated through ordinary language and shared experience. While Christian theology acknowledges mystery and the limits of human understanding, it typically insists that God has made himself known in ways that can be understood and shared by ordinary believers. Gnosticism, by contrast, has typically claimed that the most important spiritual truths are hidden from ordinary consciousness and can only be accessed through special revelation or mystical experience. This creates a two-tiered epistemology where esoteric knowledge is superior to exoteric teaching and where spiritual elites have access to truths that remain hidden from ordinary believers. These different approaches to religious knowledge have important implications for religious authority and community life. Christian communities, despite their diversity and disagreements, generally maintain that all believers have access to the essential truths of faith and that religious authority should be exercised in service of the common good. Gnostic communities, by contrast, have typically been organized around the superior knowledge and spiritual status of enlightened teachers or initiates. The globalization of religion and the encounter between different spiritual traditions has also created new contexts for understanding the relationship between Gnostic and Christian approaches to spirituality. As Eastern religions like Buddhism and Hinduism have become more familiar to Western audiences, some observers have noted similarities between certain forms of Eastern spirituality and ancient Gnosticism, particularly in their emphasis on liberation from the cycle of birth and death and the transcendence of ordinary consciousness. However, careful study reveals that these similarities can be misleading. While Buddhism does teach about liberation from suffering and the cycle of rebirth, it generally maintains a middle way that neither indulges in nor completely rejects material existence. Hindu traditions, while diverse, often affirm the ultimate reality of the divine presence in the world even as they teach about liberation from attachment and ignorance. The encounter with Eastern religions has enriched both Christian and Gnostic-influenced spirituality in contemporary contexts. Some Christians have incorporated contemplative practices from Eastern traditions while maintaining their commitment to Christian doctrine and community life. Others have found in Eastern religions confirmation of Gnostic insights about the illusory nature of ordinary reality and the possibility of spiritual awakening. The therapeutic and healing dimensions of religious and spiritual practice also illuminate differences between Gnostic and Christian approaches. Christian traditions of healing and wholeness generally emphasize the integration of body, mind, and spirit and the importance of community support and divine grace in the healing process. Christian understanding of healing typically affirms that human beings are created for wholeness and that suffering, while real, is not the final word about human existence. Gnostic approaches to healing and transformation often emphasize the recovery of hidden spiritual knowledge and the awakening of dormant spiritual capacities. These approaches may involve various forms of esoteric practice, including meditation, visualization, and energy work that are designed to facilitate spiritual awakening and liberation from the limitations of ordinary consciousness. Contemporary psychotherapy and spiritual counseling have drawn insights from both traditions, often seeking to integrate the Christian emphasis on community and moral development with the Gnostic emphasis on inner awakening and personal transformation. However, practitioners must navigate carefully between affirming the value of spiritual seeking and avoiding the potential pitfalls of spiritual bypassing and narcissistic inflation. The technological dimensions of contemporary life have also created new contexts for understanding ancient spiritual debates. Digital technology and virtual reality have created new forms of experience that blur the boundaries between the material and the virtual, raising questions about the nature of reality and the relationship between consciousness and embodied existence. Some contemporary thinkers have suggested that digital technology actualizes ancient Gnostic insights about the constructed and potentially illusory nature of ordinary reality. If human experience can be mediated and manipulated through digital interfaces, then perhaps the Gnostic suspicion of material reality was prophetic rather than pathological. However, others argue that digital technology demonstrates the importance of embodied existence and authentic human relationship rather than supporting Gnostic themes of escape and transcendence. The limitations and dangers of virtual experience may actually confirm the Christian emphasis on incarnation and the irreplaceable value of material existence and face-to-face community. The ecological crisis facing contemporary humanity also provides a crucial test case for evaluating the practical implications of different spiritual worldviews. The Christian affirmation of the goodness of creation and human responsibility as stewards of the earth provides clear theological motivation for environmental protection and sustainable living, even though Christian communities have not always lived up to these implications. Gnostic approaches to spirituality, with their fundamental rejection of the material world, offer little theological foundation for environmental concern. If the natural world is a flawed prison created by an ignorant or malevolent deity, then its preservation may seem unimportant or even counterproductive to spiritual liberation. However, some contemporary Gnostic-influenced thinkers have attempted to develop ecological interpretations of ancient Gnostic themes, arguing that the divine sparks trapped in matter include the spiritual essence of the natural world and that environmental destruction represents a form of spiritual violence. These efforts demonstrate the flexibility of religious traditions but also raise questions about the coherence of such reinterpretations. The future of both Christian and Gnostic-influenced spirituality will likely depend on their ability to address the spiritual needs and practical challenges of contemporary life. Christianity faces the ongoing challenge of maintaining its commitment to incarnation and social engagement while also providing meaningful spiritual experience and personal transformation. The tradition must navigate between the dangers of secularization and fundamentalism while remaining faithful to its core insights about God, humanity, and salvation. Gnostic-influenced spirituality faces the challenge of developing more sustainable and socially responsible forms of spiritual practice that maintain the tradition's emphasis on inner awakening while avoiding the pitfalls of elitism and world rejection. Contemporary Gnostic movements must demonstrate that their emphasis on spiritual transformation can contribute to rather than detract from the common good. Both traditions also face the challenge of religious pluralism and the need to articulate their distinctive insights while remaining open to dialogue and learning from other spiritual traditions. The global context of contemporary religious life requires both Christians and Gnostics to develop more sophisticated understandings of religious diversity and more charitable approaches to interfaith encounter. The enduring appeal of both Christian and Gnostic approaches to spirituality suggests that they address different but authentic aspects of human spiritual longing. The Christian emphasis on community, historical engagement, and the goodness of creation speaks to human needs for belonging, meaning, and hope, while the Gnostic emphasis on inner awakening, hidden knowledge, and transcendence speaks to human needs for transformation, mystery, and spiritual significance. Perhaps the most important lesson from the long history of debate between these traditions is the recognition that spiritual truth is complex and multifaceted, and that different individuals and communities may legitimately emphasize different aspects of ultimate reality. While maintaining our own convictions and commitments, we can also acknowledge the partial insights that may be found in alternative perspectives and the ongoing need for humility and dialogue in our spiritual seeking. The implications of this ancient debate extend into modern philosophical discussions about consciousness, reality, and human identity. Contemporary neuroscience and cognitive studies have raised questions about the nature of consciousness that echo some ancient Gnostic concerns. If our perception of reality is constructed by our brains, and if much of what we experience as real is actually the product of neural processing, then perhaps the Gnostic suspicion of ordinary reality was more prescient than their Christian critics realized. However, modern scientific understanding also supports Christian affirmations about the continuity between mind and body, the importance of embodied existence, and the reality of the material world. While our perception of reality may be mediated by our nervous systems, this does not necessarily mean that the material world is illusory or that escape from embodiment is either possible or desirable. The question of artificial intelligence and machine consciousness also intersects with these ancient debates in fascinating ways. If consciousness can arise from material processes, as many scientists believe, then this would seem to support the Christian view that spirit and matter are not fundamentally opposed. However, if artificial intelligence becomes capable of forms of knowing that transcend ordinary human understanding, this might be seen as validating Gnostic claims about the possibility of superhuman gnosis. The field of transpersonal psychology has attempted to bridge scientific and spiritual approaches to consciousness, drawing insights from both Christian mystical traditions and Gnostic emphasis on transcendent knowing. Researchers like Stanislav Grof, Ken Wilber, and others have explored altered states of consciousness, mystical experiences, and spiritual development using both scientific methods and insights from various religious traditions. These investigations have revealed the complexity of human consciousness and the reality of experiences that transcend ordinary waking awareness. However, they have also highlighted the importance of integration, ethical development, and grounded spiritual practice, themes that align more closely with Christian emphasis on love and service than with Gnostic tendencies toward escapism and elitism. The development of quantum physics has also provided new contexts for understanding ancient spiritual debates. Some contemporary thinkers have suggested that quantum mechanics supports Gnostic insights about the fundamental unreality of material existence, pointing to phenomena like wave-particle duality, quantum entanglement, and the observer effect as evidence that consciousness plays a fundamental role in shaping reality. However, most physicists caution against drawing such conclusions from quantum mechanics. While quantum physics does reveal the strange and counterintuitive nature of reality at the microscopic level, it does not support the idea that the material world is illusory or that consciousness can simply transcend physical limitations. The attempt to use quantum physics to validate ancient mystical insights often involves misunderstanding both the science and the spirituality involved. The environmental crisis has also forced a reconsideration of the practical implications of different spiritual worldviews. Climate change, biodiversity loss, and environmental degradation have made clear that human attitudes toward the material world have real consequences for the future of life on Earth. This has led many contemporary spiritual seekers to embrace more incarnational approaches to spirituality that affirm the sacred value of the natural world. Indigenous spiritual traditions, which generally affirm the sacredness of the earth and the interconnectedness of all life, have gained increased attention and respect in this context. These traditions often share with Christianity an affirmation of the goodness of creation while also incorporating practices for direct spiritual experience that might appeal to those attracted to Gnostic themes. The dialogue between Christianity and indigenous spiritualities has enriched both traditions, offering new resources for environmental theology and ecological practice. Many contemporary Christians have found in indigenous wisdom traditions confirmation of biblical themes about stewardship and the sacred value of creation, while also learning practical approaches to sustainable living and ecological awareness. The globalization of spiritual traditions has also created new opportunities and challenges for both Christian and Gnostic approaches to spirituality. The availability of teachings from Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, and other Eastern traditions has provided Western seekers with new resources for spiritual development, but has also raised questions about cultural appropriation and the integrity of traditional practices. Some contemporary spiritual movements have attempted to create synthetic approaches that combine insights from various traditions, often emphasizing universal spiritual principles that transcend particular religious forms. These movements sometimes display Gnostic characteristics in their emphasis on hidden universal truths and their tendency to dismiss traditional religious institutions and authorities. However, scholars of religion and many traditional practitioners have raised concerns about such synthetic approaches, arguing that they often misunderstand the traditions they claim to integrate and that they may promote spiritual consumerism rather than authentic spiritual development. The deep understanding of any spiritual tradition requires not just intellectual study but also practical engagement with its communal life, ethical teachings, and disciplinary practices. The rise of spiritual but not religious movements in contemporary Western culture also reflects ongoing tensions between individual spiritual seeking and institutional religious authority that echo the ancient debate between Gnosticism and Christianity. Many contemporary spiritual seekers are attracted to mystical and esoteric teachings while remaining suspicious of organized religion and traditional doctrinal authority. This trend reflects legitimate concerns about religious institutions, including their historical failures to live up to their own moral teachings and their sometimes rigid and exclusivist approaches to truth. However, critics argue that purely individualistic approaches to spirituality may lack the wisdom, accountability, and transformative power that come from genuine spiritual community and traditional spiritual guidance. The mental health implications of different spiritual approaches have also become increasingly relevant in contemporary discussions. While spiritual practice can contribute significantly to psychological well-being, certain forms of spirituality may also promote unhealthy patterns of thinking and behavior. Gnostic tendencies toward world rejection, spiritual elitism, and the devaluation of ordinary life and relationships can contribute to depression, anxiety, and social isolation. The emphasis on secret knowledge and special spiritual status can foster narcissistic patterns and interfere with healthy psychological development. Christian approaches to spirituality, with their emphasis on love, service, and community engagement, generally promote psychological health and social connection. However, certain forms of Christianity can also become psychologically problematic, particularly when they promote guilt, fear, or rigid moral perfectionism. Mental health professionals have increasingly recognized the importance of addressing spiritual and religious issues in therapy, and many have developed approaches that honor clients' spiritual seeking while also promoting psychological health and integration. This work requires careful attention to the difference between healthy and unhealthy forms of spirituality and the ability to support clients in developing spiritual practices that contribute to rather than detract from their overall well-being. The question of gender and spiritual authority continues to be relevant in contemporary religious communities, with both Christian and Gnostic traditions offering different perspectives on women's roles in spiritual leadership. While some Gnostic texts appear to affirm women's spiritual authority and even portray female figures as recipients of special revelation, the overall Gnostic emphasis on transcending bodily existence and gender identity may actually undermine rather than support women's embodied experience and social equality. Christianity, despite its historical limitations regarding women's roles, has increasingly embraced the full participation of women in religious life and leadership. Many Christian denominations now ordain women as priests and ministers, and feminist Christian theologians have developed sophisticated analyses of biblical texts and Christian tradition that support gender equality while remaining faithful to core Christian teachings. The LGBTQ rights movement has also created new contexts for evaluating different spiritual approaches to gender and sexuality. Some contemporary seekers have found in Gnostic texts resources for challenging binary gender categories and celebrating diverse forms of human identity and experience. The Gnostic emphasis on transcending ordinary social categories and discovering one's true spiritual identity can appeal to those whose gender or sexual identity does not conform to traditional expectations. However, others have argued that authentic affirmation of LGBTQ identity requires not the transcendence of embodied existence but rather the full acceptance and celebration of diverse forms of human embodiment. This perspective aligns more closely with Christian affirmations of the goodness of creation and the sacred value of human bodily existence, though it requires moving beyond traditional Christian teachings about sexuality and gender. The intersection of spirituality and politics also reveals ongoing relevance of the Gnostic Christian debate in contemporary life. Christian social teaching has generally emphasized the responsibility of believers to work for justice and the common good, leading to involvement in movements for civil rights, economic justice, and peace. This engagement reflects the Christian understanding that spiritual transformation must include social transformation and that love of God cannot be separated from love of neighbor. Gnostic approaches to spirituality, with their emphasis on transcending worldly concerns and focusing on individual enlightenment, have generally been less oriented toward political engagement. While this can be seen as promoting a healthy detachment from partisan politics, it can also result in indifference to social injustice and the suffering of others. However, some contemporary movements have attempted to develop politically engaged forms of spiritual practice that draw on both traditions. These movements recognize that authentic spiritual development must include social awareness and ethical action, while also acknowledging the importance of inner transformation and spiritual practice. The role of suffering in spiritual development represents another area where Gnostic and Christian perspectives offer different insights and challenges. Christianity has generally taught that suffering, while not good in itself, can become a means of spiritual growth and deeper compassion when it is faced with faith and love. The image of the crucified Christ provides a model for finding meaning and redemption even in the midst of pain and loss. Gnosticism, by contrast, has typically viewed suffering as evidence of the fundamentally flawed nature of material existence and as something to be transcended rather than transformed. While this perspective can provide comfort to those overwhelmed by pain, it may also promote avoidance of necessary psychological and spiritual work and discourage engagement with the real challenges of human existence. Contemporary approaches to trauma and healing have drawn insights from both traditions, recognizing both the importance of acknowledging and processing painful experiences and the human capacity for transcendence and transformation. The most effective therapeutic approaches often combine practical interventions for addressing trauma with spiritual practices that promote meaning, connection, and hope. The question of death and what lies beyond continues to be central to both Christian and Gnostic approaches to spirituality, with each tradition offering different perspectives on the meaning of mortality and the possibility of continued existence after bodily death. Christianity has generally taught about the resurrection of the body and eternal life in communion with God, affirming that death is not the final word about human existence but that our ultimate destiny includes both spiritual and physical dimensions. Gnosticism has typically focused on the liberation of the soul from the prison of the body and its return to the spiritual realm, viewing death as potentially liberating rather than tragic. While this perspective can provide comfort to those facing death or grieving loss, it may also devalue the significance of embodied life and discourage appropriate grief and mourning. Contemporary near-death research and investigations of consciousness at the time of death have provided new data relevant to these ancient questions, though the interpretation of this data remains controversial. Some researchers have argued that near-death experiences provide evidence for the survival of consciousness after bodily death, while others have proposed naturalistic explanations for these phenomena. The development of life extension technologies and the possibility of radical life extension or even immortality through technological means have also created new contexts for thinking about death and human destiny. These developments raise profound questions about the meaning of mortality and the relationship between spiritual and technological approaches to transcending human limitations. The educational implications of these different spiritual worldviews also deserve consideration, particularly as questions about the role of religion and spirituality in education continue to be debated in pluralistic societies. Christian approaches to education have generally emphasized the integration of learning and moral development, the importance of serving others, and the value of engaging with the world through study and scholarship. Gnostic approaches to education have typically emphasized the transmission of esoteric knowledge and the development of special spiritual capacities in prepared students. While this can result in profound and transformative learning experiences, it can also promote intellectual elitism and the devaluation of ordinary forms of knowledge and learning. Contemporary educational philosophy has increasingly recognized the importance of addressing the whole person in education, including spiritual and ethical dimensions of human development. However, this must be done in ways that respect religious diversity and avoid promoting any particular religious perspective as superior to others. The economic implications of different spiritual worldviews have also become increasingly relevant as questions about wealth, poverty, and economic justice continue to be central to contemporary political and social debates. Christian social teaching has generally emphasized the preferential option for the poor, the dangers of excessive wealth, and the responsibility of communities to ensure that all members have access to basic necessities. Gnostic approaches to economic questions have been more varied, but the tradition's emphasis on transcending worldly concerns has sometimes resulted in indifference to economic inequality and material suffering. While voluntary poverty has sometimes been embraced as a spiritual discipline, this has typically been understood as an individual choice rather than as part of a broader commitment to economic justice. Contemporary discussions about economic inequality, environmental sustainability, and social responsibility have generally drawn more heavily on Christian and other religious traditions that affirm the value of material existence and social engagement rather than on Gnostic themes of world transcendence. The question of religious freedom and tolerance also intersects with these ancient debates in important ways. Christianity, despite its historical record of persecution and intolerance, has increasingly embraced principles of religious freedom and interfaith dialogue based on the understanding that genuine faith cannot be coerced and that God's truth may be found in unexpected places. Gnostic movements have historically been more exclusive and secretive, often claiming to possess unique truths not available to others. While this has sometimes been a response to persecution by Orthodox authorities, it has also reflected the fundamental Gnostic assumption that spiritual truth is not equally accessible to all people. Contemporary discussions about religious freedom and pluralism generally favor approaches that affirm both the importance of particular religious commitments and the need for mutual respect and dialogue between different traditions. This requires moving beyond both Christian triumphalism and Gnostic elitism toward more humble and inclusive approaches to truth and community. As we conclude this extensive exploration of Gnosticism versus Christianity, it becomes clear that these ancient debates continue to be relevant for contemporary spiritual seekers, scholars, and religious communities. The fundamental questions raised by these traditions, about the nature of reality, the path to salvation, the relationship between spirit and matter, and the meaning of human existence, remain central to human experience across cultures and centuries. Both traditions have contributed valuable insights to the ongoing human quest for meaning and transcendence. Christianity's emphasis on incarnation, community, and social engagement provides resources for building just and compassionate societies, while its affirmation of the goodness of creation offers hope for environmental healing and sustainable living. Gnosticism's emphasis on inner awakening, mystical experience, and the transcendence of conventional limitations speaks to deep human longings for transformation and spiritual significance. However, both traditions also carry potential dangers and limitations. Christianity can become rigid, exclusivist, and resistant to new insights, while also sometimes failing to live up to its own moral teachings. Gnosticism can promote spiritual pride, social withdrawal, and indifference to the suffering of others, while also encouraging unrealistic expectations about the possibility of escaping the challenges and limitations of embodied existence. The most authentic and beneficial forms of spirituality, whether drawing primarily on Christian or Gnostic themes, are likely to be those that combine genuine spiritual seeking with ethical commitment, mystical experience with social engagement, and personal transformation with service to others. They will also be characterized by humility, openness to learning from other traditions, and recognition of the partial and provisional nature of all human understanding of ultimate reality. In our contemporary context, marked by global challenges like climate change, social inequality, and political polarization, there is an urgent need for spiritual approaches that can motivate both personal transformation and social action. This requires moving beyond the false choice between world-affirming and world-denying spirituality toward more integrated approaches that honor both the transcendent dimensions of human experience and our responsibility for the world in which we live. The dialogue between Gnostic and Christian perspectives can contribute to this integration by helping us recognize both the importance of inner spiritual development and the necessity of outer social engagement. It can also help us appreciate the complexity of human spiritual longing and the various ways that different individuals and communities may authentically respond to the call of the sacred. Ultimately, the value of studying these ancient debates lies not in choosing sides or declaring winners and losers, but in deepening our understanding of the human spiritual condition and expanding our appreciation for the diverse ways that people have sought to make sense of existence, suffering, and the possibility of transcendence. Whether we find ourselves more drawn to Christian or Gnostic themes, or whether we seek to integrate insights from both traditions, the important thing is to approach these questions with genuine seeking, intellectual honesty, and compassion for all who struggle with the deepest questions of human existence. Thank you for joining me in this comprehensive exploration of one of the most fascinating and enduring debates in religious history. The tension between Gnostic and Christian approaches to spirituality continues to manifest in contemporary religious and spiritual movements, and understanding these differences can help us navigate our own spiritual journeys with greater wisdom and discernment. I hope this discussion has provided you with valuable insights and has encouraged you to continue your own exploration of these profound questions with curiosity, courage, and an open heart. Please remember to like this video if you found it helpful, and subscribe to our channel for more thoughtful discussions about religion, philosophy, and spirituality. Until next time, keep seeking, keep questioning, and keep growing in your understanding of the mysteries that lie at the heart of human existence.